Home Alone came out 29 years ago on November the 10th, 1990. It was billed as a family comedy, starred the childhood star Macaulay Culkin, along with seasoned veterans Joe Pesci and John Hurt. Now, almost immediately, it became a blockbuster success. In fact, it was the highest grossing Christmas movie of all time until 2018 when it was passed up by The Grinch. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the story, the movie's about a family, the McAllister family, and their plan to take an extended vacation over the Christmas holiday to Paris, France. Now, hopefully you saw in the trailer, it's the night before the big trip. The house is sort of chaotic. People are arguing. The suitcases are unpacked. Parents are chasing their kids around the house. It's just a huge mess. When they finally sit down to dinner that night, 8-year-old Kevin instigates an argument with his family, and for his punishment, he gets sent up to his room early to go to bed early. His room is sort of a makeshift room in the attic where they've put together an extra bedroom. But there's this dramatic moment right before he ascends the stairs and goes to the attic in which he talks to his mother, and he says that he wishes his entire family would disappear. Now that night, as the family prepares for the big day, the storm blows through, causes the electricity to flicker, just enough to cause the alarm clocks to reset. So when they wake up the next morning, they've overslept, and now instead of easing their way to the airport, they're in a frantic rush to catch their flight to Paris. The problem is they're so rushed that they forget to go and get Kevin, who's asleep up in the attic. He wakes up a little while after everybody else is gone to an empty house, and for a brief moment, he is convinced that his wish has come true and somehow his family has now disappeared. Now, if you've seen the movie, then you know that at first he thinks this is a dream come true. I mean, no parents to boss him around, no cousins, no siblings to pick on him. This is exactly what he wanted. In his mind, he's convinced that this is going to be the best Christmas that he's ever experienced. The main storyline of the movie, if you've seen the movie, is about these challenges that come in and challenge that assumption. All of a sudden you have these two thieves that show up, and his focus is on his attempts to defend his home. But as you watch the movie, there's a secondary storyline that many of us can probably relate to this time of year. In several scenes, the director pulls back from the comedy and focuses on the intense feelings of loneliness that Kevin experiences during what he thought would be the greatest Christmas of his life. And the movie goes on and focuses on his attempts to navigate the challenge of defending his home, while at the same time wondering if anybody in his family is actually thinking about him and missing him. This morning we're kicking off a new series that we're calling Christmas at the Movies, and we're going to use the themes from some popular Christmas movies over the next few weeks as a springboard to get us to the real story of Christmas. Now, just so you know up front, just because we may reference a movie doesn't mean we're endorsing everything in that movie, so use your own discretion at that, but we do hope to use some of these stories that people are already familiar with. You go back and you read the Gospels, one of the things you see is that Jesus was a master storyteller. He was all the time taking stories that everybody could relate to in order to drive home some spiritual truth. And we're going to try to do the same thing. So if you have your Bible or your phone with you, I want you to go to Matthew chapter 1. And this morning we're going to look at a story of a person who, just like Kevin McAllister in the movie Home Alone, expected one thing only to have it turn into something completely different. Now, as you read through the Christmas story, it would be impossible to find someone who must have felt more abandoned and more alone than Joseph. For him, what should have been the most exciting and thrilling time of his life quickly became the most uncertain and the most challenging time of his life. Matthew tells us his story, Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. Now, in that moment, it's hard to imagine what Joseph must have been feeling. Here he is. He's in the prime of his life. He's looking forward to his wedding ceremony. In the back of his mind, he's got all these images of what life is going to be like. You know, they're going to build their home together. They're going to have kids together. They're going to grow old together. And then she shows up and she tells him that she's pregnant and he's not the father. It's like he gets this bomb dropped on him out of nowhere. And at that moment, what should have been the most exciting, the happiest, the most exhilarating time of his life quickly becomes the most painful and uncertain time of his life. Now, for some of you, it's hard to relate to that because that's not been your experience. For others of you, maybe you can relate to that because up until this point in your life, maybe nothing has turned out like you expected it to. In fact, if the research is to be believed, nearly half of the people living in the United States today are fighting the same battle that Joseph must have been fighting, the ongoing battle against loneliness. A new study came out earlier this year which labeled loneliness the newest epidemic in America. Affects 47% of adults, which is double the number just a few years ago. And we talked about this some last week, but it bears repeating. You and I now find ourselves living in a culture in which while we're more digitally connected than ever before, we're also becoming increasingly isolated from one another. But it's not just people in America. It's people all over the world. I read the same study. Researchers concluded that loneliness has the same effect on a person's health and their mortality rate as being morbidly obese and smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. That's how intense this is. And it's a global issue. In October, the BBC released a survey in which they found that 1/3 of the people living in Great Britain admit to feelings of intense loneliness. Same survey found that for people over 65 living in Great Britain, more than 50% of them now consider television or their pet to be their main source of company. Listen to this. In Japan, there are more than 500,000 people under the age of 40 who haven't left their house for any reason or interacted face-to-face with another human being in the last 6 months. They work at home, they live at home, they watch movies at home, and they shop at home. In Canada, the share of people living alone has jumped to 28% and is growing. In the European Union, that number is 35%. So what is loneliness? Researchers define it like this. Loneliness is the pain of feeling separate and disconnected. And one of the challenging things about loneliness is that you don't actually have to be alone to feel separate and disconnected. In fact, you could be surrounded by people. You could even be sitting in a sanctuary surrounded by people and still feel as if you were all alone. See, the tricky thing about loneliness is that it comes from a million different directions, but it often gets compounded this time of year. So you have a husband who lost his wife prematurely. You have a wife who said goodbye to her husband. You have somebody who's went through a nasty divorce and they watch all the Christmas movies and everybody's there together and everybody's smiling and happy, but that's not been their experience. They're trying to navigate the landmines of shared custody. It can happen when you retire or when you move or when somebody you love moves to a new city. They leave you behind to pick up the pieces. And the point is that there are a lot of things that can happen over the course of a normal year that can leave you feeling separate and disconnected. And if that describes your situation, I want you to pay special attention. There are 3 things you see in the story of Joseph are all things that you and I can experience on a normal year that can get compounded at this time of year and leave us feeling like we're all alone. Here's the first one. It's strained relationships. Now, if you're a married person, if you've ever been engaged, you might try to, put yourself in Joseph's shoes and think about how you would have handled this situation. But before you do that, it's important to understand that relationships in the first century were a lot different than they are today. For one thing, in the first century, couples who were engaged or getting married, they didn't date. All their marriages were arranged by their families. In fact, the only time they would even see each other is at public gatherings when all their family were around. So in that sense, even a romantic relationship was a very public experience. during that time period, engagements also worked different. They were broken down into 2 time periods. The first time period was known as the betrothal period. Now what that meant is these 2 families would get together, they'd draw up a contract, both sides of the family would sign the contract, and at that point you were considered to be legally married. So it'd be like having a marriage license all filled out and turned in without going through the ceremony. Then for the next 6 months, maybe up to the next year, there was this period in which the would-be wife and the would-be husband would prove their love and commitment to one another. So the idea was kind of like once you were betrothed to each other, you were legally married, you just didn't live together. Then when that period was up, they had the wedding ceremony. And in those days, a wedding ceremony lasted up to 7 days. Now in our culture, we've got it down to about 15 minutes, right? You might add a song, you might add a unity candle, but for the most part, it's about 15 minutes. In that time period, it was a week-long party. And then when the ceremony was over, the wife would go home with the husband, and everybody would live, happily ever after. So here's Joseph, and here's Mary. They live in a very small town, and we all know that in small towns, people like to talk about each other. And not only do they live in a small town, both their families have been a part of this relationship since the very beginning. Their families are intertwined. Everybody's got their hand in their relationship. And now, Mary's turned up pregnant. And the only thing they know for sure is that Joseph's not the father. So what do you do now? Talk about feeling lonely. I mean, you read this story, I don't know who had it worse, Mary or Joseph. In verse 19, Matthew makes it clear that Joseph was a good guy, and rather than publicly humiliating Mary, he decided to go through with a quiet divorce. And yes, it would eventually go public, and yes, there'd probably be some rumors floating around and some unanswered questions, but at least if he just kept his mouth shut, something else would eventually happen and people would move on. But at this point, the only thing that Joseph knew for certain was that the one relationship that he was most counting on had left him feeling alone. Some of you know what that's like. A premature death, an unexpected divorce, an unexpected job loss, a miscarriage, a job offer that never came, a relationship that never got off the ground. You add all those things up together and it can leave you feeling separate and disconnected. It can also lead to the second thing that you see in Joseph's story, and that's this: an uncertain future. What do you do when your life gets redirected in a way that you never saw coming? Think about Joseph's situation. Here he is. The only thing he knows for certain is that everything he thought he knew has now been called into question. Is he going to have to move away, to escape the rumors? Is he ever going to find another relationship like the one he thinks he's losing? Is he ever going to find that peace and happiness and contentment that he was counting on? I mean, so many questions and very few answers. And then you get to verse 20, and the strangest thing happens. God himself steps into the story. Check out verse 20. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus, because he will save people from his sins. I don't know what would be the bigger curveball. Your fiance showing up pregnant telling you that God's the Father, or God himself sending an angel to tell you the exact same thing. You go back and you read Luke's telling of the Christmas story. He says that the angel Gabriel came to Mary to fill her in on what was about to happen. Here, this angel comes to Joseph through a dream and tells him that rather than divorcing Mary, God is inviting him to play a key role in these events that will alter the course of history. But here's what I want you to catch. Even though Joseph now knows what his next move is supposed to be, he still has no idea how all of this is going to play out. See, you and I read this story, and we already know how it ends, right? I mean, you've read this, you've seen this, you've been to the Christmas plays, you've heard this read year after year, but this was brand new information to Joseph. He had no idea what to make of it. All he knew is that his future, the future he had built in his mind, is now uncertain. So what's he do? Check out verse 22. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now check out this part. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. So here's Joseph. All he knows is that the angel told him to do something, and he gets up and he does it. Now at this point, you would think that God would ease up on Joseph, right? I mean, here's this guy, all right, you put him in an impossible situation. He's been asked to do something. Most of us probably wouldn't have done it. He gets up and he does it, and most of us unanswered questions, we say, Lord, you show me how this is going to turn out. Joseph doesn't do any of that. So in my mind, if there's ever been anybody that deserved a break, it would be Joseph. But that's not what happens. Instead of catching a break for Joseph, things get worse. These are the third thing you see here, this intense opposition. If you're familiar with the way the Christmas story goes, then you know that as soon as Joseph and Mary go through with their ceremony, it's like all the forces of evil unleash their fury, and they try to put a stop to what God is up to. For example, when you get to Matthew chapter 2, this angel of God visits Joseph for a second time, only this time he's got bad news. I want you to look on the screen with me at what the angel tells me. He says, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and escape to Egypt." One problem, Egypt is 400 miles away. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. Problem number 2, one of the most powerful people on the earth is now trying to kill your child. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and he left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now, in the movie Home Alone, what Kevin thinks is going to be, the greatest Christmas of his life gets interrupted because of 2 incompetent robbers. In the Christmas story, for Joseph, what should have been the happiest time of his life was threatened by a ruthless and powerful dictator who made it his job to seek out and destroy this child that Joseph had been entrusted with raising. And now his only hope for survival is to load up everything he can, take his young family 400 miles across the desert and go to a place where he doesn't know the language, he doesn't know anybody, and start over. And that's after he's already left his home to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem. For Joseph, every time he turned around, it seemed like there was a new challenge. Think about all the pressure that he was under. There was financial pressure. To be honest, we don't know much about Joseph. What we do know is that he was not a wealthy man. He was a carpenter in the first century. Now, respectable job, but most carpenters in the first century did not become wealthy. Some of you can relate to that. You work hard all year long. You make the pieces fit together, but then you get to the end of the year and it's a little bit tighter. The budget's a little bit harder to make everything fit. You've got to buy a few extra groceries for these big meals, and then you got to buy these increasingly expensive gifts for people that you love, and it can be a challenge. Then there were the travel challenges. Think about Joseph. First he had to get him from Nazareth to Bethlehem, then from Bethlehem to Egypt, and then when he's there, he's got to secure a job. He's got to find a place to live in a place where he doesn't speak the language and he doesn't know anybody, and there's no safety net to fall back on. Some of you are facing your own travel challenges this year. You may not be moving to Egypt, but you've got other things. You feel like you're being pulled in different directions. There's office parties and family events and church events and community events and school plays and travel schedules, and all of that adds up, and it comes at you from a lot of different angles. Then you add to that the pressure of raising your kids, the pressure of the end of one year and the start of another. Maybe you've got some health issues that's causing you some pressure. I mean, it could be any number of things, but it all adds up, and it all takes a toll. There's something else here I want you to notice, though. One of the things that I think Joseph was dealing with, at least at some level, was this idea that God had called him and invited him to fulfill a very specific mission, and deep down inside, he didn't know if he was up to it. I mean, you think about his situation. Have you ever felt like God was calling you to do something and you didn't know if you could do it? I mean, let's give Joseph some credit. I mean, if an angel showed up and told me, hey man, I want you to raise God's son, I'm out. You know what I mean? I'm going to go do something else. I'm not going to accept the responsibility. And I think that's where Joseph was. I think he took the responsibility, but then he had to wonder, who am I to try to raise God's son? And maybe if you're a parent or a grandparent, you've thought the same thing. Not about God's son, but about your kids. Who am I to try to raise kids? I mean, if people only knew how messed up I am, there's no way they'd entrust me to raise children. Or maybe your doubts are different. Maybe you've asked yourself, who am I to be running this business? Who am I to be leading this family? Who am I to be teaching these kids? Or maybe you have this little voice in your head that keeps saying, if people only knew the real you, they never trust you to do whatever it is you're doing. And here's the deal. If you're not really careful, all of that, man, the strained relationships, the uncertainty, the opposition, the self-doubt, all of that can leave you feeling separate and disconnected, especially at this time of year. So what do you do? What do you do when it feels like what should be, the happiest time of the year becomes the most challenging? Two things you see in the example of Joseph. Here's the first one. You choose faith over fear. One of the things that makes Joseph's story so interesting, to me at least, is that even though he had a lot to be afraid of, he had a lot of unanswered questions, he continued to trust God. He continued to choose to be obedient. He continued to follow God's direction even when he wasn't sure where it was taking him. For Joseph, it was a daily decision to choose faith over fear. So the angel says, hey, want you to marry this girl. He gets up and he marries her. Angel shows up a second time, wants you to leave everything you've known, go to a foreign country and live as a refugee. And Joseph does it. In every instance, he chooses faith over fear. He chooses to put his trust in God's direction rather than trying to figure it out on his own. Now compare that to what most of us do. Joseph trusted God enough to take the next step. Most of us, if you're like me, God asks us to do something. We say, okay, God, but here's what I want you to do for me. I want you to show me what the next 10 steps are. Or show me what the next 5 steps are so that I know which direction I'm heading and how this is all going to turn out. But that's not what Joseph does. That's not usually the way God operates. Usually God comes to you, shows you what to do, and he expects you to take the next right step before he shows you the second right step or the 100th right step. And I think all God's asking us to do is do the next right thing. To choose faith over fear and take the next right step. Here's the second thing you see that Joseph did that you and I need to do. You choose obedience in the midst of uncertainty. One of the things I really look forward to this time of year is going to the movies. Now, I don't know why that is, but this time of year I find myself going to the movies more than at any other time of the year. And apparently I'm not the only one who does that because December is normally the biggest month of the year for movies. I think it has something to do with all the family time. You know what I mean? You go hang out with your family for a couple hours. Somebody says, hey, you want to go to the movies? Yeah, I'm in, We kind of find our way to the theater. But if you're a person who watches a lot of movies, then you know that every story is built around some sort of tension. There's some sort of challenge that has to be overcome. There's, a mystery that has to be solved. There's a war that has to be fought. There's some sort of conflict that has to be resolved. But here's what's so cool about watching movies. Whether you go to the movie theater or you're streaming them in your house, when you're sitting there and you're watching the movie unfold, you know things that are happening that the main character in the movie doesn't know yet. So, for example, in the movie Home Alone, one of the storylines is how Kevin keeps wondering if anybody in his family has thought about him or if they're missing him. What he doesn't know is that the person watching the movie does know is that as soon as his mom discovered that he'd been left behind, she embarks on her own journey to get back to the house as quickly as she can and be reunited with her son. But Kevin doesn't know that. All he knows is that he's alone. He has no idea that behind the scenes, his mother is doing everything she can to get back to him so that they can experience a reunion. And sometimes as you go through life, we find ourselves surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. You look into the future and you can't see what it's going to look like. You lay down at night and the questions that you have no answer for circle around your mind. And what we often forget is that behind the scenes, we have a Father in heaven who's working diligently to get us to where he wants us to be. We only see part of the story. We see the part of the story that's right in front of us, but God sees the whole picture. You see, Joseph was one small but important character in a story that was much bigger than he could have ever imagined. And you are too. And I am. And because of that, our job is to stay faithful and to choose obedience even when it looks uncertain and even when we feel lonely and disconnected. This past week, I read an article with this headline. Here's what it said. Why it was not a wonderful life for Macaulay Culkin after he found fame in the hit Christmas movie Home Alone. I have a picture I want to show you. This is Macaulay Culkin just a few months ago. That's the little boy that was in the movie clip that you saw earlier. Now today, it's hard for us to remember this, but back in the 90s, man, it's hard to overstate how popular this guy was. One Hollywood power broker called him this generation's Shirley Temple, which some of you older folks know who that is. That's pretty high praise. Listen to this. Between the ages of 8 and 11 years old, he starred in the highest grossing comedy of all time, became the first child actor to be paid more than $1 million, and was the second youngest host of the hit TV show Saturday Night Live in history. All of that before he turned 12 years old. In 1992, 2 years after the release of Home Alone, they made a sequel called Home Alone 2, which earned a staggering $359 million at the box office. In 1993, as a 12-year-old boy, he was ranked as the 48th most powerful person in Hollywood, coming in ahead of such legendary figures as Michael Douglas and Eddie Murphy. When 1994 rolled around, he was cast for the leading role in another movie titled Richie Rich. Some of you remember that. And unfortunately, for Macaulay Culkin, that's when the wheels started to come off. Because instead of being the third blockbuster of his young career, the movie Richie Rich was a total flop at the box office. At the same time that he began reeling from this unexpected flop in his professional life, his parents' marriage began to dissolve. And they went through a very nasty, very public divorce. Stories of neglect and abuse and mismanagement began to trickle out into the media. As a part of the court proceedings, his mom and his dad both accused each other of mismanaging their son's growing fortune. At the same time, they're using his money to pay their legal bills, and it just goes on like this for a couple of years. When it was finally over, as often happens, both sides were unhappy, and the family was financially decimated. As he tried to navigate this new reality, Macaulay himself fell into some bad habits. Started experimenting with drugs. By the age of 16, he was spending $6,000 a week on heroin, which further decimated his dwindling reserves. As his professional life continued its downward spiral, his professional life also continued to deteriorate. There's two sides of the same coin. And like happens with so many childhood stars, as he grew older, the phone stopped ringing. And when the phone stopped ringing, the checks stopped coming in. In a recent interview, he opened up about some of the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father and some of the bad decisions he made. He described himself as, quote, a tortured soul. By his own admission, his story is a story of family dysfunction, broken relationships, unrealized potential, addiction, and deep regret. Something else he said that I thought was fascinating is how, apart from a few public appearances, like this time of year, sometimes you'll see him on like The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, sort of a nostalgic thing. But for the most part in this interview, he said during the Christmas season, he stays in his home. In fact, he said during the month of December, there have been times when he would not leave his apartment for days on end, never step foot outside of his apartment, because he knows that during the Christmas season, he's more likely to be recognized, and he doesn't want to have to deal with it. Now, I really wish I had a cool ending to this story. Right? I looked for one, and I wish I could tell you that after years of suffering alone, that Macaulay Culkin became a Christian, his whole life got turned around, and it's a fresh start, but I can't tell you that. Hope that's true, but I don't know that it is. Here's what we do know. Today, he's 39 years old. He runs a comedy blog with a friend of his. He occasionally works as a roadie for a European rock band, and he dabbles with his own band, a few shows a year. And what started out as the name of a movie has in many ways become his life. For the most part, he's estranged from his family. As he said, he spends the holiday season mostly in his apartment and mostly by himself. And what started out as a comedy for him has become a tragedy. As I read his story, I couldn't help but think to myself, I wonder how many people sitting here today, how many people watching online can relate to his story. I don't mean like the childhood actor part, but I mean the tortured soul part. How many of us, if we were honest, would have to confess that we can relate to the family dysfunction, the broken relationships, the unrealized potential, the addiction, and the regrets? My guess is it would be more of us than would want to admit it. Some of you right now can feel that. Maybe nobody knows it but you. And maybe as you sit here in this sanctuary surrounded by people, there's a part of you that still feels alone. And if that's you, I want you to know there's hope. Verse 23 of Matthew 1, Matthew says it like this: the virgin will give birth to a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. At no point in your life have you ever been alone. God's been there the whole time. He's been beside you. He's been in front of you. He's been behind you. He goes before you. He watches your back the whole time. He's whispering your name, doing everything he can to draw you to himself. So here's the question as we get ready to enter into what can be a crazy, busy season. Will you take a step toward him? Will you take one step toward him? I want you to stand. It was the great Corrie ten Boom who said, never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. And as we close today, we're going to sing a song we sing a lot titled Surround Me. And the key to remembering in this song is that God's already surrounded you. We're just asking to be made aware of his presence. So if you're here today and you feel like you're separate and alone and you need some help navigating this challenge, Dave and I will be here. We'll pray with you. We'd love to talk to you. Maybe some of you need to take a step towards him in baptism, a step towards praying with somebody, a step towards moving your membership here. Whatever it is the Lord is calling you to do, we want you to take the next right step. Not the next 50 steps, not even the next 5 steps, but just the next step. And if you need to pray with somebody, we'd be glad to pray with you.